Welcome to Equity Strategy Prosperity, powered by equity, driven by strategy and focused on prosperity. Putting you on your journey to your financial prosperity. Whether you're building your portfolio, whether you're refining your portfolio, or whether you're scaling your portfolio, this podcast is for you. It's designed to give you the opportunity to make smarter decisions with your property investment. So let's begin with something simple. Property has created more everyday wealth than any other asset class in Australia. And yet most people only ever use a fraction of its potential. Yes, they own a property, but they don't necessarily use the property strategically. And that gap between ownership and strategy is where the opportunity is either realized or lost. This podcast is about closing that gap. There are two numbers that frame this entire conversation. Around 70% of Australia's wealth is tied up in residential property. At the same time, roughly 60% of Australians say they want to use their property to actively build wealth, to create more choice, more flexibility, and more security. So on one hand, the wealth is already sitting there. On the other, people are unsure how to unlock that properly. That disconnect isn't about intelligence, it's about clarity. What really holds people back, the biggest obstacle in the market, isn't investing, it isn't interest rates, it isn't affordability alone, it's a lack of structure. They don't fully understand equity, they don't fully understand borrowing capacity, and they don't understand how structure influences long-term outcomes, long-term sustainability. So decisions get made in isolation rather than part of a broader, deliberate plan. Equity is the engine room to every strategy. So let's look at a practical example. Here in South Australia, since 2020, the median price of homes has risen by 76%. So if someone bought a house in 2020 for $500,000, that property today would be worth at least $880,000. If they originally borrowed $400,000, over time, that debt has reduced to $250,000. So the gross equity is now $630,000. Now, of course, not all of that is accessible. With lenders, you can borrow up to 80% of the property value before you hit lender's mortgage insurance. So that 80% value of the property would be $700,000. If you take away a $250,000 loan, that gives you equity of $450,000 that you can use to your next property. Now that's meaningful. And that's where this process starts. It's the first step in your strategy. But this is where discipline really matters. Before accessing your equity and buying again, you must understand your borrowing capacity. And I don't just mean income minus expenses. I mean understanding structure. For example, can superannuation play a role? Could a self-managed super fund allow you to invest in property within the concessional tax environment using your current balance, your future contributions, and rental income? Most people never explore that. With my clients, we do. So your borrowing capacity is your standard as well as your self-managed super fund. Once you understand your borrowing capacity, your true borrowing capacity, and all the available structures, you start to build confidence. You start hoping and you start planning. Now, once equity and borrowing capacity are understood, the next step is positioning. Pre-approvals matter. Pre-approvals provide clarity. It allows you to enter the market knowing exactly what you can do. And it changes how other people are going to respond to you. Agents and vendors take a pre-approved buyer much more seriously than any other buyer. Two similar offers can land, and depending on whether they have finance or not, one will proceed and one won't. It's not dramatic, it's just simple, smart preparation. It's interesting because this is where a lot of people drift. They've done their work, they understand their numbers, they're positioned properly, and they step into the retail market without strategy. They understand their numbers, they're properly positioned, but then they step into the retail market without strategy. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with on-market property, but it's competitive by design, and competition influences prices. That's why it's important to understand all available lanes, including off-market opportunities before making that decision. To illustrate that, One client purchased a property for $920,000 straight after we had done his calculations. In 6 months, that had increased $30,000. And he was ecstatic. At the same time, in fact, on the very same day, I had another client who bought a property for $610,000. And after 6 months, it had grown by $75,000. The same broader market, but a different entry strategy. The difference wasn't luck, it was approach. One client understood his borrowing capacity and went out the very next day and contracted on a property because he could. The other chap spent his time going through the market, ultimately to find the property by going out into agents across his chosen area to finally get an outcome. So would you rather 2.5 times the return over the same period for 50% less investment to enable you then with that 50% to go again? Or would you rather be happy with your $30,000? That is the essence of what equity strategy prosperity is all about, giving you the information and tempering that desire to, now that you know what your borrowing capacity is, to go out and do something about it. Now, of course, not one strategy fits all. There isn't a universal strategy per se. Some people will want development exposure. Some people prioritize yield. Some people are focused on tightly held locations. Some simply need a structured first acquisition. The key is alignment. Your risk tolerance, your borrowing capacity, and your time horizon. They're all critical aspects of your end goal. And that's what strategy is really all about. As we move into the next episode, you'll hear from Karen Brownson, principal of 28th Street Agency. She's an experienced buyer's agent and a genuine advocate for her clients. What I deeply respect about her is that with every transaction, she gives back just as I do. And that's a commitment to making a real difference. Her business supports Catherine House with every transaction. And that matters. Because prosperity, in my view, isn't just about accumulation, it's about contribution. We can build wealth and create impact at the same time, and that's a far better outcome. So there we are. That's the very first episode of Equity Strategy Prosperity, designed to grow your financial prosperity. You've been with Peter Bardadden, powered by equity, driven by strategy, focused on prosperity. See you next time.